Brian Stewart describes himself a writer defending the American system, a joy to friend and a woe to enemies. And I got to tell you, Brian, I read your stuff. I like your Substack. And then I felt guilty because I knew I was having you on today. So I was like, damn, I'm going to pay the $59, whatever it is, because you put the work out there. And then it was, you want to pay? No. And then I keep reading your work. I thought, no, I'm going to have them on. So I broke out the credit card. So don't spend it all in one place. Okay, Brian Stewart?
Much obliged.
Okay. I like the fact that you're in the dark. It makes us even more mysterious. Hey, we wanted to talk to you because I read a piece that you had written about ISIS and just generally it brings in the history of it, the jihad, and you follow this. And I wanted to just run through a couple of possible scenarios of because now we've been talking recently, everybody's talking about what happened there in New Orleans. Let's just start with the fact that the quick history of it. So in 2014, there in Syria, the ISIS, the JV team, said, "Hey, listen, everybody, come here to Syria and come to Iraq. We want to get everybody in here, all the 40,000 fighters. We're going to do this great big caliphate. We're going to take over the world, and soon in one day, the ISIS flag will flutter above the White House. Let's get this jihad going." So, and then things kind of got broken up for a little bit, and then Assad falls December 6th, 2024, and ISIS was sort of broken up. The U.S. went in there, dropped a bunch of bombs, took out a whole bunch of folks. France got involved as well. So here's a couple of questions for you, Brian, as you study all of this. How strong is ISIS right now in Syria, and how much of a threat are they to America and to our other allies?
So the threat from militant Islam, both in Syria and in the ungoverned spaces in the Iraqi desert, is quite large. It's chronically underrated, and Western intelligence agencies indicate this, that the gap between where these groups are. ISIS is a primary force with maybe 10,000 forces in the Syrian and Iraqi deserts, and they stand to gain a great deal of influence in the post-Assad Syria, because at least superficially, Assad was an enemy of the Islamic State, even though his primary goal was to suppress the democratic rebellion among even more secular forces. So the threat from ISIS is significant, it's growing, and it requires American leadership and military force to put down, which is precisely the conditions that destroyed the caliphate back in 2015 through 2020, when Obama's policy initiated degrading and destroying the Islamic State. And President Trump's continuation of that policy continued to diminish its power.
So at this point, you say possibly 10,000. Who's funding them?
So there's a global network of jihadist financiers, regimes that are tied to Sunni militant groups, and again, between it's good to remind ourselves that the Sunni Islamic world is 70% of Muslims globally, and the remainder, the remaining 30%, the Shia,
yeah,
is 30%, and these forces are bitter rivals. But the Saudi bloc, as it's thought of, and the other Sunni Gulf states are the primary financiers of ISIS, and but there's financial pockets in Europe and the United States, Canada, really throughout the Western world, where sympathetic fronts are stood up to, often posing as charities, to finance militant Islam, both in its Sunni garb and its Shia garb.
So I think it was Sam Harris, and I think you might have quoted him when he was on Bill Maher's show a while ago, and he's on there arguing with Ben Affleck. And it was Sam's sort of diagram that he expressed. He said, so take three circles, put a circle in the middle. Those are the Shiites, the people, the true terrorists that are in there in the middle, the very center circle, that are calling for, the caliphate to destroy everybody. And then the next circle outside of that are Islamists. And then the bigger circle are conservative Muslims. And he was saying, so you get 1.3 million Muslims. Not everyone is a terrorist, but there's enough terrorists. If they're 1 or 2%, that's still a huge number. So the question is always, why are we Americans so hesitant to call out ISIS attacks and Islamic attacks against our allies and against ourselves? Is it the fear of being accused of being Islamophobic?
Yes, I think that's a primary driver that really since the September 11th attacks, both U.S. administrations and our European and Arab allies have been loath to diagnose the Islamic roots to an ideology that is deeply embedded and is quite mainstream in the Muslim world, which is not to say that a majority of Muslims are sympathetic to this ideology, but it is to say that they are susceptible in a way that really requires greater attention than we've brought to bear.
When they, being ISIS, recruit Americans, they do this in the deep web. They're able to get in contact, I'm sure, the FBI with the 702, which is allowing them to surveil foreign adversaries, and then they can catch Americans in this. They don't need special warrants for it. How do you have any idea how they go about recruiting and how they get somebody like that guy in New Orleans?
Well, it's a global ideology, and this the suspect in this case fits perfectly in with many of the European attacks that we've seen over the past decade, where you have a lot of either second or third generation immigrants from Muslim majority countries, or even recent converts. This is not atypical. And so these radical groups, from ISIS to Al-Qaeda, they place a premium since the caliphate was destroyed. They place a premium on kind of remote attacks and sponsoring a network where they can give spiritual guidance, can even help select targets for attacks by Americans and Europeans. Initially, before the caliphate was confronted by American air power along with Kurdish ground forces, you saw a phenomenon where they would bring, as you mentioned at the top of the program, 40,000 citizens from European and American and North American countries to train in Iraq and Syria, and then to return to their places of origin, to their nations of origin, to carry out attacks. That is no longer feasible since the conduits and the passageways have been blocked to Syria and Iraq. But the emphasis now is inciting the sympathizers of Islamic Jihad already residing in the West.
So someone like the alleged the man that drove the Ford over the bodies of those people enjoying New Year's Eve, New Year's Day there. We're learning more about him. I think it's now that he'd been married and divorced 4 times, was having all sorts of financial problems. This is the story we're getting it, as of today, that he was on there contacting with ISIS. They radicalized him, and then they tell him, we've saw it in the Christmas market. We've seen it in Nice. We saw it in New York. Get a car and just run down as many people as you possibly can. ISIS wants this to happen in a very public way because is it a way of sort of motivating others to do this? And what do they promise the driver of that Ford?
Well, the promise is only in the afterlife, and that returns us to the hesitancy of Western policymakers and leaders about calling this by its right name. Again, we may need to maintain a very clear division between the Muslim faithful, many of whom are not sympathetic to violent schemes, and to some of the violent texts within Islam that can be activated. And this is really believed in by again, it's a minority, but it is a substantial and significant minority within the Islamic world. And they believe in the doctrines of martyrdom and paradise. And that is motivating a not insignificant number of Muslims, not only in the Middle East, but increasingly in Europe. I think Europe remains more at the forefront of this with kind of unassimilated Muslim minorities, but also, as we've seen, not just with this attack, but even dating back to 2009 with Major Hassan and the attack at Fort Hood in Texas, where it was another crude attack where he picked up this active duty soldier picked up his M16 and fired at his fellow soldiers, killing, I think it was in the double digits.
Yes.
So this is a threat that is not going away. And it's a threat that demands being confronted both ideologically and militarily.
But the more Muslims you kill, with every Muslim that you kill, aren't you in effect recruiting more Muslims that could possibly be radicalized by the religion that says a non-believer, you die as a martyr, you go to heaven. A survey of 78% of British Muslims said that they were in favor of punishing the Danish cartoonist, who was punished, quite obviously, when he was shot and then stabbed and then beheaded in public there after having the cartoon of Muhammad. And then when Yale Press banned images of the Muhammad book in a new book, they basically acquiesced to concerns not to show. So here you have America with its, First Amendment, but yet here you have major publishing and newspapers and media organizations that are cowed to not offend, right? For fear of offending. But is it also a fear that their lives might also be in jeopardy?
Yes, and they certainly are in jeopardy. But I think the correct response to threats against civil liberties, and not to sound too arch about this, but to civilization itself, is to spread the risk and not to let single publishers or writers within the Muslim world, free thinkers within the Muslim world, or simply combatants who are on the battlefields confront this threat. It should really be a collective response from the liberal West that we won't be pushed around by violent theocrats who seek to not only change our own way of life, but to impose a barbaric system on vast swaths of the Middle East, which, as we know from experience, the problems of the Middle East are the opposite of the Vegas rule. What happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East.
Yes. You are working, I assume, on another story. Have you followed? I know this is just completely off the top of my head here, and I might be catching you off guard. Are you following the story coming out of Las Vegas regarding the body and the Cybertruck? Have you been digging into this one, Brian Stewart?
Yes, I think I'm not alone, though it's still unclear at my last search if... There's as yet no evidence linking this to the New Orleans attack.
Yeah. I don't think there's a connection, but there's a lot of questions regarding the driver of the car and a bunch of other stuff as well. Listen, again, as I said, Brian Stewart there, the great work that you do at National Review and your Substack, highly recommend. You are a excellent journalist. You leave no stone unturned, and I love the way you turn a phrase at the same time. So enjoy your weekend there in New York, Brian. Thanks for coming on.